Hello everyone, welcome to another video in this full stack Flutter development series. We are still in our authentication module where we are now developing our authentication backend using Node.js and TypeScript. And in this video, we'll be creating our repository that will sit on top of a MongoDB database. So we'll learn how to implement MongoDB and also to test that it is working as we expect it to. So here we have the interface for auth repository that we are going to implement. So now I will start by creating another folder and I'll call it data. And inside this folder, I'll create two other folders. One I'll call models and the other I'll call repositories. Repository. So inside our models, this is where we'll create our MongoDB model and also the schema, which will represent how the JSON object will be saved in the MongoDB. So I'll create a user model, and this model will represent a Mongo document. But before we can create this model, I must first install MongoDB. So I am going to say npm I. So I'm going to use this library called mongoose. So I'm going to install mongoose. So now I have mongoose installed, and if you should look in your package JSON file, you should see under dependency mongoose. And in order for it to work with TypeScript, we also need to install the mongoose types. So I'm going to say npm I again, but this time I only need it for dev dependencies. And I'm going to say at types / mongoose, and this should install those mongoose types for TypeScript. So now we see here that it is a part of our dev dependencies. So back to our user model. I am going to create an interface, which in this case, the interface does not represent a contract, but just represent how the data must look, or the kind of data that I'm collecting for the mongoose or for the Mongo database. So this will extend a mongoose document. So in order to extend a mongoose document, I must import, say all as mongoose. I'm going to import that from mongoose. So I'm going to extend mongoose document. And then inside here now, I'll type the fields that the document should hold. So now string. So that is the type, which represents the authentication type. The name, which is of type string also. The email. And the password, which is of type string also. I will also create here and export it the MongoDB schema. So I'm gonna say user schema will be a new mongoose schema. And again, the schema represents the logical representation of what the data will look like in the MongoDB or in the Mongo database. And it has certain characteristics that allow you to validate the data using the schema. So for example, type. So I want a type to be represented in the database. And this should be of type string. And I'm going to say that it is required. So required should be true, so that if there's a record that is sent and there is no type, then that won't be written to the database. We will receive an error from the database. So the name is string. And as you can see, this string is different from the TypeScript string type, because this is a MongoDB type. So, and also email. And the email is the same as the type. Email is always required. And then password. You can also have various validations on the password if you wish. You can have functions that would validate the password, that it is of certain length, that kind of thing. But since we're using a password hash, I'm not focusing on that. So here we have our user model, or mongoose or mongo model, and the schema. And you will see where that plays an important role in writing information to our MongoDB. So inside our repository now, I am going to create our auth repository. I'm going to say export default as usual. As we know, that's how we create our classes in TypeScript. Export default auth repository. And I'm going to implement iAuth repository. So those two methods, the add and the find method, quickly add them. And inside our interface, inside of our repository rather, for our dependency, we are going to pass inside of our constructor a private read-only client, which will be a mongoose client. So this will be a mongoose client. So for our find method, we are going to remove this so that it is a promise user, not using the path directly. The promise user, right? So now, how we'll implement this? We will say const users, or this will represent a Mongo document. that is fetched from the database. So, or our collection, a Mongo collection. So I'm going to say this client, which is the mongoose client, model, which now I will use the user model as the type, and I'll pass in the name of the document and the schema. So now we have access to our user document inside of our Mongo database, and also we have to pass in the model so that we can have intelligence in regards to the information that we are expecting from that document and the schema itself. So now I can say user, which is what I'm going to fetch this user now, and I'm going to say users find one. So I want one user from the collection. So yes, I'm sorry, but this is a collection, the collection of users in the Mongo database. So you will have a collection that is named user that will hold users. So I'll say find one, and I'm going to pass in the condition or the where clause. So find one where email is email. Since I'm getting error here, this must be an async method, so for the await to work. And then now I can return, after I've found the user, I can return a new user. So now this is the domain user that we are returning, and we'll pass in, we're creating a new domain user from the model information that is returned from the database. So domain user, and so ID will be user ID, and you have name, which is user name, and also, as you can see, as we are filling out, it is using the optional character. I do not want to use the optional character because this is suggesting that there's a possibility that no user existed. So what I'm going to do before is I'm going to check. So I'm going to say if not user, then I am going to return a promise reject, and inside I'm going to say user not found. So now I can get rid of the optional operator. So I have user name, email, and password and type. So that is our user that is returned from the database. So now for our add method, our add method is pretty simple. So for add method, we are going to do the same thing. So we're going to say const user model equal client again, model, and the same thing as before, so that we can get access to that particular document in MongoDB. So now I am going to say const saved user equal, I'm going to await user model create. So there's a method create to create or add new users to the database. User model create, and now I'm just gonna pass in the data. So type should be type that is passed in the function, and we have name, email, password, hash, and then I'll return the saved user ID, because now when the user is created, Mongo will generate a user ID that we can now return for that newly added user. So these are the two methods we have now for our MongoDB repository. And in order to test this repository, we will have to set up our MongoDB. So one of the ways to set up MongoDB is, instead of installing it locally, we can use the Mongo Cloud, which gives us 512 megabytes of free storage space that we can use for sandbox testing purposes. So we'll look at that. So here we are, mongodb.com, and let us go to the start free option, and here you can enter your information to create an account. So you enter your information to create an account, and after you've created an account, we can sign into that account. So I'll just sign into my account. And now there are a few things that we must set up in order to get started with this. The first thing is that we need to have a database user. So we can go to data access and we can create a database user here. Because in order to access Mongo, we will need a user. So you simply add a user, enter the password, enter the username, and I would suggest using the auto-generated secure password. I would suggest you use that and copy it, because there is some problem when you use your own password. If there's any special character in it, there is a problem where URL parsing is concerned, and so you might not get access to the database readily. Might get some error about password incorrect. So I suggest that you use the generated password for now. And after you've created the user, you'll also need network access. So this is where you whitelist the particular IP address that you will be using your machine, your local machine from. Or you can just enter zeros so that it will accept all requests from anywhere. So you do not have to use your particular IP address. Just add zeros and you are good to go. And after you have created the database user and the network access, now you need to create a cluster. So you create a cluster, and then from the cluster you can go to connect, and it will show you how you will connect to MongoDB. So after you have set up your database user and you whitelist your IP address, this will be good. So you choose connection method and choose connect your application, and it will give you how to connect the application. So as you see, the URI is here. So you would copy that URI with you and your username, your password, and the DB name will replace those placeholders. So inside of collections, you will go to collections, and here you will create a database, a test database. So I say food app test. So you create a test database, and then inside the test database, you can create a users document or collection, a users collection, and you can use this add button, or you can allow Mongo or mongoose to create it when we run the test in Visual Studio Code. But you can create your users collection here, and you will have to create it a certain way with all the necessary fields that will be right into it. Or you can create it and leave it as it is. So now that we set up our test database and set up our data access or network access, now we go back into Visual Studio Code and test that everything is working as we expect it to. So again, I'll go into my test folder. On the auth, I'll create data, and then on the data I'll create repository, and I'll create my auth repository. Spec ts. Now what we are doing now is known as integration testing and not unit testing, because we are testing how our application integrates with the database itself, and not a mock of the database but an actual database. So these tests are normally slow, so it is not recommended that we have a bunch of these tests in our application. So we'll just have those two methods and a simple test to ensure that everything is working as it should. So let us set up our test. So describe, I am going to say auth repository. And inside our dependencies, or for our dependencies, I'm going to say client should be a mongoose client, so of type mongoose. Or I'm just gonna say import mongoose from mongoose, and this will be a mongoose client. So for system under test, it is our auth repository, and then I'm going to set up our hooks. So before each test, I want to set up my dependencies. So I'm going to say client equal new mongoose mongoose. So new mongoose client, I'm going to say the connection string to the client. I'm going to use encode URI just in case there's any special character, and you'll pass in the connection string here, and then we would say client connect, and we'll pass in the connection string along with some options. So we'll say use the new URL parser true, and also use unified topology true. And then we would say after that sut equal new auth repository and pass in the client. Then after each test, then I'm going to say after each test, I want to disconnect from the client. So for our connection string now, I want to use an environment variable, an environment variable to hold our connection string instead of writing it exactly here. So I will go to the Mongoose website again, and I will go to network access. Rather, I'll go back to clusters and go to connect your application, and I'm going to copy the URI here, and you can copy your URI. And I'm going to put that in an environmental variable. So to create a new file, and I'm going to call it .env, and I'm just gonna say test db equal, and I'm going to paste that. Now you would replace password with your password and db name with the food app test. That's the name that I gave the database. But if you give it a different name, then you'll replace this with that name. So after the environment variable, in order for us to access this environment variable here, we'll use a JSON or npm package known as .env. So I'm going to say npm i .env. I'm going to install that package, and after it is installed, I'm going to import it here inside my test. So I'm going to say import env from dot env. And then the first thing before anything happens, I want to call .env and call the config method. So this now allows my process environments to have access to all my environment variables set up in my env file. So now that I have I can say URI process env and the name of the environmental variable, which is test db, and I have to parse it or cast it as string. So inside your environmental variable, I would suggest that you remove the quotes, leave it as it is, remove the semicolon and leave it at that. So now for actual test, I am going to test, I'm going to say it should return user when email is found. So I'm going to set up this test now. So I'm going to use an email that I have for a user inside my DB. So I've already added this user inside the DB. So you can add a user that you will test. Password equal pass. So now for my action, I'm going to say result equal await sut find, and I'm going to pass in the email. So now I should expect that result to not be empty. So that's my expectation for this test. So if I should run this test, now we have a passing test. So it's fetching the user from the database. And as you can see, if I should go back to the database, go to my collections, users, I have two documents. And here's that user with mail@mail.com. So that test is passed in and the method is working as we expect it to. So for the next test, I want to ensure that the data is being added or the user is being added. So for other tests, we want to ensure that the user is being added to the database. So I say should return user ID when added to DB. So I'll create a user with all the fields necessary, and then I will say sut, call the add method, passing in all the information and then I expect that the result, which should be the user ID, is not empty. So I'm going to run this test to see if it is passing, and also check the database to see if the user is added. So now it says that it is passing. So if we should check our database, if I should refresh users, then there should be another document, and here it is, John Flynn. So the user is added as we expected to. So our auth repository is working, is connecting to our database, is fetching records or users from our database, and is also adding users to our database. So this is where I'm going to stop in this video, and the code is on GitHub if you wish to get it from there. And see you in the next one, guys. We will be implementing our controllers and routes and how we can connect to those routes. So thank you, and see you in the next one.